Okay. All right. Welcome to, I guess, after hours lecture. Me and Father Ryan Hallford, who is y'all's chaplain currently, decided to make our own video because a lot of you told me that you wanted to know why do we believe in Christianity? What about all the other world religions? Like, how do we know that Christianity is the right one? And so I went and did some searches on YouTube, and I found a lot of YouTube videos, really good ones about why we believe in God at all. And I found a lot of videos about the differences between Catholicism and Protestantism, like why would we choose Catholicism? But there weren't a whole lot of videos out there about why Christianity among all the other world religions. But there is a lot of information and a lot of thought about that. And so Father Ryan and I just wanted to kind of give y'all, as best we can, kind of an introduction to that thought. So
Yeah,
welcome, Father
brief
Ryan.
overview. Yeah, and I think this is really an important question. It's something I remember facing myself, like why Christianity among the many vast different possible belief systems we can have. And I'm reminded of a sentiment that sometimes you hear a lot of atheists express, right? Originally expressed by Stephen Henry Roberts. He says this, he says, I contend that we are both atheists, right? I just believe in one fewer God than you do. And when you understand why you dismiss all the other possible gods, you will understand why I dismiss yours. And I think he brings up this interesting concept, right? If I say I believe in some type of higher power, some type of God, how do I make sure it's just not arbitrary? Like, am I just believing in it because this is what my parents gave me, because this is what society says? And how sure can I be that my belief system, something that I may have just received from others, is actually true? And I think this really points out a real danger. Just because we receive our faith from our parents or from another person or people influence us, this doesn't dissolve us from our intellectual responsibility to know why what we believe is true, good, and beautiful. And so this is the primary responsibility we all have, is that while we should respect authority, it has a role. We should know eventually as we grow up, why does authority teach what it teaches? And how can we make sure that we're actually choosing it for ourselves and not just something that we're just accepting blindly?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've had that experience as well. Like, I was baptized Catholic and raised Catholic, but
Mhm.
at some point in high school and in college, I started really asking these questions, like, why do I believe this? Like, it really not like, uh, you know, where did it come from? Like, it came from my dad, but like, why is it true? Is it true?
Mhm.
Like, that's the question. Like, is it logical? Is it true? And so that's what a lot of my studies were. Gratefully, I had some good teachers in high school, but also just going on to study theology, trying to answer some of these questions for myself. And so yeah, so there are very
Mhm.
logical arguments out there that,
Yeah.
to me, I mean, obviously I'm Catholic, so I believe that they make sense. But it's not just a random belief like, oh, I've just decided that I want to believe that something is true, but it's actually something that's reasoned out, right? So
Yeah.
yeah.
I remember one philosopher, Peter Kraft, said in one of his lectures, he said, there's only one good reason to be Catholic, and that's because if it's true. And if it's
Yeah.
not true, you shouldn't be it. Because if
Right.
you're saying like, oh, I'm only going to be Catholic because, it makes me feel better about myself, or, it's like the idea that we have to believe in a delusion or a lie in order to live our
Mhm.
lives. That is not consistent, first of all, with what the church teaches.
Yeah.
And I know, like you, even for myself growing up, there were these kind of moments where I was kind of confronted, like, do I really want to believe this? Is this something I really feel compelled? Is this something that
Right.
helps me live the life I feel like I'm called to? And so I remember even in junior high studying with, agnosticism. Maybe God exists, maybe he doesn't. He probably doesn't exist, even being what's called a weak atheist, right? Like, I'm not sure God definitely doesn't exist, but he probably doesn't. So I'm just going to assume he doesn't. And even, accepting Christianity and eventually trying to live that out. I remember there were times, even when I got to college, even in seminary, when I started studying philosophy and world religions, there's a few times where I had to take a pause and like, okay,
Really consider.
let
Yeah.
me think through this. Yeah.
Excuse me.
Let me readdress this to make sure that
Mhm.
I'm acting with, in my own conscience and sincerity. And this is something that I want to dedicate my life to doing. for
Yeah.
sure.
Awesome. All right. Well, I figured if you're good, we could just jump into it.
All
Um,
right.
Made ourselves a little outline here. Let's see. So, if we accept that there's some sort of divine creator, right, some sort of
Mhm.
God, right, then how do we end up kind of narrowing that down to the point where we believe that A, there's only one God,
Mhm.
B, that God is somehow distinct from the world around us, right, and then C, like, eventually, how do we know that Jesus is the God, right? Like that he is it,
Yeah.
right? Like he's the one. So that's kind of the pathway that we kind of need to take, right? And then throughout that, we're going to kind of find some of these other religions, right? These other world religions like Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam and Judaism, right? So like, how do we arrive at Christianity? So I guess you want to talk about the three major categories, just
Yeah.
briefly.
Or even before that, in my mind, I think when you're trying to go from, how do I believe, maybe I've accepted a creator, some type of
Mhm.
divine being, some type of supreme power, a higher power, and how do I get from there to Jesus, as you're saying? And I'm thinking of three things. One is, um, what what can we discover about God through using reason, right? If
Mhm.
God exists and he somehow is the creator, what are certain things that are intrinsic to that nature of being a creator? What can we use our natural reason to determine? And that might help sift out and filter out certain belief systems that we would want to avoid.
Mhm.
Secondly, looking at human nature and experience, right? There are certain things that we know that as humans we need in order to be happy, in order to survive, life,
Mhm.
and things that protect our life: food, shelter, education, a life of reason, friendship, community. And so when we look at our human experience and own desires intrinsic into our heart, then it's reasonable to expect that whatever belief system that our God who has designed us has in place, that we can look at our human experience and our human heart in order to help us understand what this religion should also speak to. It should speak to our humanity because
Right.
it's something that fulfills us. And then thirdly, when we look at history, what are the historical concrete claims of these different religious traditions,
Mhm.
and who offers something that is consistent both with philosophical reasoning and our human nature? And I really
Mhm.
think it's the convergence of these three things:
Mm.
human reason, human nature and experience, the historical claims of different religious traditions, that together, this is really what makes Christianity so compelling, and that makes sure that our decision to be Christian isn't something that's arbitrary or just merely what we have inherited from our parents. And so
Yeah.
with that, I think you have three kind of major categories of belief in an ultimate reality, right? And then
Mhm.
there's a lot of variations on these, but really it's monotheism,
Mhm.
the belief in a one transcendent personal God. You see this among some primitive religions. You see this most explicitly in the three major religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Mhm.
Another category is polytheism, the belief in many different gods. Historically, this was found in also in many tribal religions, even Judaism, the surrounding religions that they grew up with, and even
Mhm.
they struggle themselves in the belief in polytheism.
Right.
We see this in the Germanic tribes in the Western Empire. We see this in the Greek and Roman pantheon of gods. We've seen this historically found in many tribal religions originating out of India. And then, so monotheism, polytheism, and another kind of major variation is pantheism.
Mm.
And it's just a belief that it's almost kind of this in between, right? That maybe maybe we won't go with many gods because there's some philosophical, intellectual problems with that, but that maybe we are somehow, everything we see is a manifestation of the divine, right? There's a
Mhm.
blending of these two. That somehow the ultimate reality, the divine, is in and within everything. And so that's
Right.
what
So like
pantheism is.
let's just clarify. So pantheism would be like when I look outside at the tree and the sky and the clouds and like I see you and me and like all these different things that like that all is God. Like that's all
Yeah.
God himself. Yeah, or
Yeah.
itself.
It's not
Yeah.
distinct from God. There's no distinction between the creator and creation, right? It's a blending of the two.
Okay.
And we see this in the West. We see this in some type of Neoplatonism from
Mhm.
Plato. We see this in certain Stoic traditions. And the East, and something we're probably more familiar with in terms of thinking of it, we see it in mainstream Hinduism and various forms of Buddhism, and to some extent of the Taoism that we see in some of the Asian origins. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so why then, if you want to start, I don't know, you want to start with polytheism and talk about
Yeah,
like,
let's start with polytheism. Yeah.
okay, so
Um,
many gods, right?
mhm.
Hinduism,
Well,
maybe?
yeah, Hinduism is probably one of the more ancient ones. I think something that
Okay.
we're probably more familiar with is we have a lot of mythology that all of our
Yeah,
students study,
Greek and
about the
Roman and all
Roman and
that.
Greek
Yeah.
gods, I think it's interesting because when you look at those gods, they're really no better than really powerful children,
Yeah.
right? You don't really look to the Greek and Roman gods as a model of how I want to live my life, right? Zeus, as powerful as he is, and as noble he might be at certain times, other times he doesn't have the best interests of humanity. He's
Yeah.
petty. You see in these Greek and Roman gods a projection of sometimes the best and the worst attributes of humanity.
Mhm.
And quite frankly, they're not really gods worth believing in, right? Like maybe
Yeah.
you worship them because you don't want them to hurt you, but you don't really that's not really someone you admire or you would want to
Mhm.
have a healthy relationship with.
Right.
And they're not really necessarily even concerned with about what's best for us. They may play favorites. Those
Mhm.
types of relationships you would have with these gods tend towards relationship of manipulation or appeasement.
Mhm.
Maybe I can trick the gods and they can give me something I want, or they try
Mhm.
to trick me to get something they want. And that doesn't really speak to our human nature, the type of
Mhm.
relationships we know that we are really designed for and we desire.
Mhm. It seems just more
Something
like humans with superpowers, right?
Yeah,
Like,
basically, right?
yeah,
And not necessarily good humans, right?
yeah, yeah.
And so it's interesting. Now, when you get to Hinduism, which is, as far as we know, this is one of the most ancient religions in the world. And it's also one of the ones that there's a great variety of belief systems that kind of follow under the umbrella of Hinduism. There's a
Yeah.
lot of disagreements about the exact, and we see even a development in
Mhm.
it. And its earliest origins, it was polytheistic. We know that we suspect that it came from Assyrian tribes. Remember the Assyrians in scripture, they're the ones who destroy the northern kingdom,
Mhm.
right? These Assyrian tribes migrated to India from the north in around the second millennium BC, and you start seeing this development of the blending of different religion and tribal people, right? So you may have had your tribal god, you may have had your tribal god, you may have had your tribal god, and so you really see this kind of blending where how do we have a belief system that takes into account these different tribal gods? And so this is one of the
Mhm.
things we see in Hinduism is the belief in these many lesser gods that are really tied to these different tribal locations.
Gotcha.
And so in that kind of develops what Hinduism is going to have several developments over the years. Something that's maybe, while there's no fixed creed or the organized structure we see in Christianity, we're
Mhm.
going to begin to see this focus on detachment from desire, including the existence of being a distinct I. So there's going to be a lot of emphasis on self-denial. There's going to be a development of a caste system,
Mhm.
which the idea that you go into a higher or lower caste based on your deeds regulated by the law of karma, which is not unlike the golden rule, right? When we treat
Yeah.
others well and we live a good life, maybe we'll be reincarnated to a higher caste system. And when we're bad and we're mischievous, we're going to be reincarnated into a lower caste system. And
Mhm.
this idea of human development through these different reincarnations, that
So
we
one
all
thing
get this. Go ahead.
So one thing that would come out of that, I would think, would be like, okay, so we're living this current reality right now, like in
Mm-hmm.
2020. So if I see a person who is destitute, poor, impoverished, whatever, it would be like in a lower like caste, then it's their fault, right? They're there because in a former
That's
life,
right.
like they did that to themselves, kind of thing. But if there's
Yeah.
somebody who has it all, right, and they're kind of on the top of society, then like, oh, they must have been super good, like they deserved it, they earned it, kind of thing.
Yeah, this is
So
one of the big criticisms of the caste system, which
mhm.
there's, even in these Hindu Indian areas today, there's a lot of inequity. There's a lot of presumption, of course,
Mhm.
towards people in a lower caste system that They don't necessarily have the equal dignity as you.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore you don't really have to give them the time of day if you don't want to. I mean, there's a certain sense of them being beneath you. They deserve to be there. You deserve to be here.
Mm-hmm.
And so that can have some social implications as well.
Yeah, so a Mother Teresa doesn't make sense to a Hindu,
Mm-hmm.
right? To
That's
go
right. This
into
is
the
one of the
poorest of the poor
controversial
and serve.
natures. Yep.
Right.
That's right. She comes up with this kind of Christian ethos that everyone has intrinsic dignity, and
Mm-hmm.
that, the reason why people might be in poverty, yes, maybe their personal decisions have contributed to it, but they are made in the image of God, and they
Mm-hmm.
have the same dignity as she does,
Mm-hmm.
and that her vocation is tied into serving them as to serving Christ. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one of the accusations, is she is turning upside down the caste system.
Mm-hmm.
And that those who have more, it's because they're expected to serve more, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can already see where a Christian morality would come into conflict with this Hindu caste system.
Cool.
Okay. One
Okay.
of the things we see in the development is it changes, though. It changes over time. From going from this belief in many gods. So some people would say Hinduism is kind of hard to classify. Is it polytheism? Is it monotheistic? Is it some type of pantheism? And in reality, it kind of depends on who you ask or what you're emphasizing.
Mm-hmm.
As
So
they had these different tribal gods, they're going to develop this understanding of a personal understanding of the absolute, which could be worshipped under the form of the many gods. And so maybe you had these many tribal gods, but maybe they're just a different manifestation or faces of the one true absolute God. And that's going to be something we see as well.
Mm-hmm. So some Hindus might say that's the case, and other ones might understand it differently. There's no like universal, this is Hinduism kind of thing.
Yeah, there's just a lot of variations. And you see that in Hinduism. They'll say, well, actually, Buddhism is just another expression of Hinduism. Or there are just many different ways to achieve nirvana, to go through life and to kind of going to a higher and higher caste through reincarnation. And so there's not really this really fixed creed as there is in other situations. And so one of them is, maybe it kind of develops in, some would say, even a pantheism, that maybe even all things are a manifestation of the absolute. But they still have an emphasis on a personal God, which would make it different than what we tend to think of as a pantheism. But yeah, so many Hindus hold that every religion is really just a different path to the same goal.
So if they believe that, do they believe in a sort of like, I guess, almost like a predestination or like a lack of free will, that basically like whatever I do, eventually I'll get there, wherever there is?
Yeah, I guess I'm not that familiar in terms of, is there an eternal cycle to everyone gets where they want to go? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of there being any, in the West, when we think about religion, we tend to like to define our terms and think logically through things. And there's not as much of an emphasis on that as there is in more kind of mystical traditions. Sometimes they focus on the unknowability of certain things. And so while there might be a certain sense of that, I don't know that there's anything quite spelled out like that. I don't, but then again, I would have to defer to someone who knows a little bit more. And this is part of the problem. There's no magisterium.
Yeah.
Right? Like when we want to know what we believe about free will, we could pick out the catechism, we could go to church document, we could see some authoritative teaching, like the church teaches this about free will. There is no magisterium, and this is why there's so much confusion, right? Because in one sense, there seems to be some notion of an absolute reality and the supreme God, Brahman, which has manifested in other gods, a polytheism, but somehow the universe is a part of Brahman, a pantheism, which pantheism believes in an impersonal God, but some Hindus believe in a personal God. And so maybe it's a panentheism, that all is in God. And really, it's just really confusing. It's really hard to pin down. All the point is, it's complicated.
Yeah, to me, at the end of the day, like, it seems frustrating, like, that I can never know, like, how do I ever know, And then if I can't know, then how do I determine how to live my life, like, what's the best way? I think, like, the thing about, like, every religion path to the same goal, I feel like I hear that from some people just in general about all world religions, like, what would you say to, like, somebody saying, like, oh, well, all religions are good, like, eventually they're all just leading to the same thing, or they're all basically the same? What do you say to that, just briefly?
Yeah, I mean, but even that is an absolute claim, right? That you want to say all religions are good. I mean, I think even you use the word think and thought. Like we
Yeah,
always want to seek truth, and we know that two opposite things can't be true the same way,
right.
right? So either all religions are good and lead to the same thing, or they don't. Um, those claims are mutually exclusive.
Mhm.
I think the problem is that it's comfortable to think that our religions are the same. But if a religion is asking you to do something evil, if it's asking you to believe in something that's not true, if it's asking you to live your life that could actually compromise your deepest desires of your human hearts, like I find that highly problematic. And why we might want to absolve ourselves from the responsibility of thinking through these things, because it's nice to think like, oh yeah, everyone's gonna make it. It doesn't matter. If we're engaging in willful ignorance, right? I mean, as a church, we believe that it's possible that someone who, through no fault of their own, did the best they could still go to heaven. That doesn't dissolve us or enable us to engage in willful ignorance. If we had the ability to know the truth, if we had the ability to know that we were meant for love, that we're meant to live out a loving relationship with God and each other, and that God has given us the means of to empower us towards that mission with the sacraments. If we actually have the ability to know that, but we refuse it, that actually represents something about our hearts, and maybe ultimately about the type of relationship we're willing or not willing to have with God for all eternity. And so that's a big question that we shouldn't just be like, oh well, I guess it
Yeah,
doesn't really matter. Like it does
yeah.
matter.
The fact that we have the ability to think through these things, to me, kind of points to the fact that we should think about these things. You know, that maybe there is a logical reason. You know, there's logical reasons for a lot of things in the world. You know, like why would there not be for this as well? You know, especially if it's our ultimate destiny or our what ultimately created us, why we're here. You know, then like shouldn't those
Yeah.
things all line up? You know, and shouldn't we be able to discover them?
And I would even say this, if you think about how much as a society we just expect that we're going to invest ourselves into learning things for a career,
Yeah.
right? When you think about like, hey, I want to become a doctor, how many years are going to study? I'm going to become a lawyer. What do you have to know? There's going to be a lot of work that goes into developing the skills and having the knowledge necessary in order to do that. If we're talking about our ultimate destination, we're talking about the ultimate meaning of reality, why wouldn't we similarly just expect there's a certain amount of intellectual effort, self-reflection, and developing, in engaging in the serious thought in order to discover how we should live our lives and what God is and what He wants from us in our life.
Absolutely. All right. So when we're talking about, let's like kind of just return to like the idea of polytheism, right? So when
Mhm.
we're talking about these various religions that have beliefs in many gods, like ultimately, why does this not work? Like, what do we know intellectually about the Creator God that would make us conclude that a polytheistic religion is not adequate to logic?
Yeah, I would say one of the things we see in the natural reasoning of many thinkers is that if there is a God, if there's a creator, then God has to be one, right? Because if we're talking about the absolute, if we're talking about this fundamental relationship of creator to creation, then whatever this creator would have to exist without the limitations of creation, because the creator is responsible to creation, is outside of creation, is distinct from it. And so if we think that maybe there's many gods, right? That if you're entertaining that maybe there's not just one divine being, but there's multiple divine beings, well, think about that for a second. If you have more than one thing, if you have two things, for example, there has to be, in order for these two things to be distinct, there has to be some difference between the two, right? So God A and God B, in order to be different gods, there has to be some difference between God and God A and God B. And so if there's a difference, that means one God has something that the other God doesn't. And when we think in terms of power, the power that makes God God, or the power that God has, according to the very nature of being God, it means that one of the gods would have a limit that the other God doesn't. There'd have to be some difference. And that means that one of the gods is not all powerful. And if it was lacking something, it was more limited, then that means it would, in a certain sense, it wouldn't be God. there would only be one God. The other one would be something distinct from God because its nature would be a variance from the one true God. And so even when we start thinking about that, then we'd have to conclude that there's only one God, because the existence of more than one would put a limit on them, and that one of them would cease to be what we mean when we say God. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. That, yeah, like if you're gonna have somebody that is all powerful, right, then you're not gonna be able to have two of them, right? Because
Yeah,
then
you can't have two all-powerful gods, because
right.
one would have to have some power the other one hasn't, and then
Yeah.
therefore wouldn't be all-powerful, and therefore wouldn't be God.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
Another kind of thing that's related, especially as we talk about Hinduism, is even to take in a concept of something like Buddhism, right? Which has a very different understanding. I think it's interesting because while Hindus will look at something like Buddhism and say, well, maybe this is just another expression of Hinduism, right? They might even claim Buddhism. When we look at the original doctrine of Buddhism, and we have a lot of people today, especially in the West, especially even America, that really dabbles in this because they find some of the philosophical truths of Buddhism to be noteworthy. And actually, there is a lot of good there that I think we should be in dialogue with.
Yeah, you see a lot of like
Buddhism,
celebrities and people today kind of being like, oh, I'm Buddhist, and you're like, oh, really? Why? It's, I don't know, it's funny. It's almost like trendy or something.
yeah. And I think a part of it is that it doesn't necessarily, kind of similar to how Hinduism has gone, it doesn't necessarily adhere to a fixed absolute claims. It doesn't necessarily speculate about whether there's a God or there's gods in the same way. They don't really focus on eternity or the non-eternity of the world. They don't even talk that much about nirvana, at least originally. But one of the essential questions is the question of suffering, which, a lot of people, especially anything you do on atheism, this is one of the primary questions, is how can we achieve liberation from our personal sufferings?
Right.
And I say that because even you have some people that are atheists that identify as Buddhists, right? Just as a philosophy of life. But this is really the central concern of Buddhism. How do we get rid of suffering? And their response is, you get rid of the self. You get rid of desire, because it's our desire for truth, our desire for goodness, our desire for healthy relationships. All these things, these desires, they say, would be at the heart of our suffering. And so if we want to get rid of suffering, then we could just get rid of ourselves. And so it really becomes, in that sense, a really this focus on self-help, or how do we save ourselves, right? Which leads to a lot of.
I was just gonna say, we save ourselves by getting rid of ourselves, like kind of ignoring, in a certain sense, ourselves, right? Isn't that kind of what they're getting at?
Yeah, because it tends towards a dualism. The self is bad, and so if you want to get good, live a good life, then you need to discipline the self to the point where the self is irrelevant. And so this is going to bring a different emphasis than Christianity as well, right? I think it's interesting because when you compare the two, Christianity also tells us and says a lot about living lives of virtue, lives of self-control, lives of self-discipline. But I think one of the interesting big differences between kind of Eastern mysticism, the mysticism of Buddhism, and the meditation, right? Buddhists fast. They engage in self-denial. Well, guess what we also do as Christians? We fast.
Same thing, yeah.
We pray. We engage in self-denial. Now, they may not be praying to a God. They may just be meditating. But I think it's interesting because you can have something in a world religion that's, on the surface, it seems like it's exactly the same, right? They fast. They meditate, they engage in selfless acts, and we're kind of supposed to do the same thing. But here's the big difference. Buddhists will fast in order to empty themselves, right? To get rid of the self through self-denial, to be empty for the sake of being empty. So what's the goal of fasting for the Buddhists? To be empty, to be without desire, to empty yourself of all attachments to the world. And therefore, when you get rid of desire, you tend towards nothingness or emptiness. Now, think about it. Christians, we also fast. We also want to make ourselves empty, but why? We empty ourselves for the sake of making room for God, for making room for each other, to have healthy attachments. We don't become empty for the sake of being empty.
Right.
We become empty for the sake of being filled in relationship. And so it anticipates an exchange of love.
Yeah. Have you ever seen, this just came to my mind, have you ever seen the show Avatar: The Last Airbender? Have you ever watched it
Yes,
before?
actually, I was just talking about this the other day. Yeah.
Were you, there's one episode, and it's sort of a spirituality is similar to Buddhism. Some of it
Hmm.
is anyway. But he goes to this guru, and he's trying to teach him to like unlock this like power that he has or whatever as the avatar. And he tells him that he has to empty himself of all attachments. And like the very last thing, like in his progression that he has to do is to empty himself of any attachment to anything or
That's right.
anyone whatsoever. And he has to be able to do this in order to have this power. And to reach this like enlightenment or whatever. And he is in love with a girl,
Hmm.
and he can't let go of her. And there's something in him that rebels completely against this like letting go. And ultimately he leaves the guru without having unlocked that last like section. But what's interesting is then to me, like throughout the rest of the show, like he ends up kind of offering himself, like he's willing to suffer, he's willing to kind of not be able to control, I guess, like certain aspects of his state in order to like love the people that he's trying to serve. And so I felt
Hmm.
that was sort of interesting, that it was like almost a critique of that like emptying for the sake of emptiness. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that's when we talk about one of the primary criteria to discern the true religion, we're talking about taking in consideration seriously human nature and the desires of our human heart.
Right.
Is whatever we're called to believe a contradiction of these desires for love? Now, obviously, love can be distorted. There become unhealthy attachments, and often we don't really know what it means to will the good of the other properly.
Mm-hmm.
But even in Buddhism, love really, in that way wouldn't make sense. So even when we talk
Mm-hmm.
about willing the good of the other,
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about having healthy attachments or relationships, and so I think that's becomes really a part of this debate is that do we accept that our human desires, even though they can be distorted and disordered, that they are fundamentally good,
Mm-hmm.
right? In that sense, we see a lot within Buddhism this kind of unhealthy dualism that the
Mm-hmm.
life of the spirit is good and the life of the body is bad. And we
Mm-hmm.
think about the relationships that we want to have with others, they typically tend to have certain emotions rooted in our human bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And so, therefore, we have to judge them as being bad as something that we have to suppress or detach ourselves from. And so, it really leads to a lack of integration between body and soul.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
Right.
that
So
becomes one of the big issues.
right. So the desire that we experience, so like back to desire, like the
Hmm.
Hindu or even the Buddhist would say like, okay, the desire is what we need to let go of because the desire is what causes pain. Like we all experience this
That's right.
ache, right? We all
You don't want to
have this,
suffer.
right,
Yeah.
but we all suffer. We all experience the desire for something greater, that
Hmm.
we look around in the world, and even the greatest, relationships and the different things we can have, money, fame, power, whatever, like nothing ultimately like is satisfying. We have this ache, right? So for them, like the solution is to suppress the ache by not desiring anymore. So I'm going to convince
Yeah.
myself that I don't desire. But in the Christian thing is like there actually is a fulfillment of that desire, right? And
Yeah.
that
And,
fulfillment is
and there's
God.
a hierarchy of desire.
Right.
There's a hierarchy of desire. Because even think about fasting. We don't fast because we think earthly pleasures are bad.
Right.
Or we
Yeah.
don't think earthly pleasures are as great. We don't think created goods are as great as the uncreated good of God.
Right.
And so one of the things we know in our everyday life, one of the things we know that anything that we want to achieve is that if we can't say no to pleasure, if we can't say
Mm-hmm.
no to lesser goods, we're
Mm-hmm.
not going to be free to say yes to the greater good of God, to the greater
Mm-hmm.
good of each other, to what really love is calling us to in the moment. And so we say no to lesser desires in order to be able to say yes to those deeper and most fundamental desires of love, right? And
Right.
so it's not a suppression of desire. It's not a detachment of all desire. Rather, it's a proper ordering of our human nature towards this fulfillment in God.
Cool. All right. Anything else you want to say about any of that? Hinduism,
Yeah, I mean, I
Buddhism,
guess the other thing to
polytheism.
add is that just in terms of goodness, we see these different competing. You see it with the Hindu caste system that man isn't intrinsically good, and therefore, and there's certain norms about what is good. And those norms could seem arbitrary, right? Especially in the caste system. Why can't I treat some people with dignity and others? One of the things you see in Buddhism and kind of these things that kind of tend towards pantheism, God is anything, is that everything has to be treated with respect, right? I can't even, some Buddhists won't even kill a bug, or, because it's considered violence. And so there's an understanding that there's different understandings of what morality is based off of what we think is good. One of the things I want to say for sure, though, is just as we can think reasonably that God is one, I think something else we can know is that God is good. And that whatever religion we believe, I think it has to have a proper understanding of goodness that takes into account human nature and what we know to be good via the natural law. And that whatever we know to be God, that his divine nature would be in congruence with that, because ultimately what we know through nature would be a mirror or an expression of divine law, of the divine nature. And so if God is the source of all that we recognize as good, if God is a source of all being, then God cannot be evil in any way. And then what God creates also can't be evil. So we get there not only the goodness of creation, but also the goodness of human nature, the goodness of those intrinsic desires that we have. And so I think this is also leading us to having a proper understanding to reject certain religions that would engage in this dualism, spirit good, body bad, or that we somehow have to be suspicious or deny those authentic and good desires at the heart of our human nature.
Cool. Yeah. I don't know if we should discuss maybe the understanding of good and evil as like something positive versus like a negative or a lack. I don't know if that's good here to discuss.
No, I think that's, so we would say that even when we say that God is good and God creates creation good, we say that good and evil are not equals, right? We don't believe like there's a good God and there's a bad God, like some type of polytheism where that there's these two competing equal forces.
Right.
Rather,
because again, you can't have the two all-powerful forces because it's contradictory, right?
Yeah, you can't have an all-powerful good force and all-powerful evil force. And in fact, when we presume that God has all perfections, one of the perfections just isn't power, it's actually goodness. And really an all-powerful evil God, that's almost a contradiction in terms, because not good, that's a problem. So we would say that really when we talk about evil, we're talking about the absence of goodness. Or think about moral evil. Anytime we choose a lesser good over a greater good, that's where there's evil, right? So pleasure is good, power is good, honor is good, wealth is good. These are good things. But you know what? You're better than those things. And so when I treat money as more as a greater good than I do another human person, that's evil. I'm choosing a lesser good over a greater good. And this is the same true of God. When we choose the lesser goods of creation over the greater good of God, the evil exists in our will. It's not a positive thing. It doesn't exist the same way. Rather, it exists the way that darkness exists to light. Light has a positive existence. It has a source. It emanates forward. Darkness is just the absence of light. You don't generate darkness. You generate light. But then when you block that light, when you impede that light, when you distort that light, that's where darkness creeps in. It's always a distortion of light. It's not. It doesn't have the same
a lack or like a whole. Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. So should we move on to? Do we talk enough about pantheism? You think? Or should we talk about?
So. I think maybe talk a little bit about monotheism.
Okay. So monotheism. So the belief in one transcendent God.
So there's three major ones that we tend to think of.
Right. So Islam, Judaism, and Christianity.
Okay. That's right.
So start with Judaism, I guess, historically.
Yeah. So historically, it really acts as it acts as the origin of both Islam and Christianity. It predates it. Both Islam and Christianity claims Judaism as a part of its spiritual heritage, right? And you see that when you look at Judaism, when you look at the Israelites in the Old Testament, they're trying to be faithful to the one God, the God whom they're in a relationship with, and that they've learned that this one God is not only just the God of Israel, but the God of all creation. And so you see them kind of protecting their understanding of this personal God up against the pagan tribes around them and trying to learn what it means to be faithful. And so, yeah, so in Israel, the Israelites, they would have attended temple liturgy. They would have attended synagogue service on the countryside. They believe even today that the Messiah is coming, this promised one of God. But as monotheists, they believe that God is absolutely one. And one of the great distinctions between them and Christians is they don't believe in the Trinity, right? We believe in the same God as they have, but we have a better understanding of who God is. Some of the things we share with them is we share this belief in the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, and this personal God who has entered into a relationship with humanity through this special mission with the Israelites that they and their offspring would benefit all of humanity. We resonate with the same view of human nature, this idea that we desire a relationship with God, that we know that faithfulness to God is going to bring life and unfaithfulness is going to bring death. Spiritually, right? We know this, that when we are faithful to the commandments, we feel more alive and one with God. When we're unfaithful, it brings drama and disconnection and being divided against God, which is a form of death. We believe with them a God who is merciful, who will deliver his beloved from death, but that somehow even in death, God will provide. So there's a lot of commonalities regarding human nature about who God is. I think one of the main differences, and that one of the qualms that Christians would have with Jews even today, is that they stopped short from recognizing that Christ was the one that God promised, and therefore they have not really developed that we really see Christianity as a continuation of Judaism, not as a contradiction, but really as a fulfillment of what God began with them.
So the idea of Jesus, of like the law being summarized as love, like this ultimate, like willing to the good of the other, right? That kind of love. That, I don't know, like in Judaism, how would you say? Is it like a maybe not quite developed to that, or is it, or?
Well, I guess it depends on who you ask, because there's a lot of Christians in disagreement in terms of how we view the law, and I think this is something we'll get into later, why Catholicism over other Christians, because there's plenty of Christians that have an improper view. They may focus, and so why the law, right? And this is actually one of my favorite conversations. You probably have heard me say this in homilies, at St. Michael and on the March for Life, but when we look at the commandments God gives us because he wants us to be in relationship with him. And one of the most important things we can remember is that it's not about the rules, it's about the relationship. And so if you think about even the first three commandments, I'm the Lord your God, have no other gods before me. What is he saying? Choose me because I choose you. Don't cheat on me with other gods. Be faithful to me. Be one with me. Do not use the Lord's name in vain. What is the Lord saying here? Respect me. Let my name mean something to you. Be a sign of intimacy, a sign of trust, a sign of relationship. Right? It's not about the rules, it's about the relationship. So choose me, don't cheat on me, respect me, defend me, don't pretend like you don't know me. And the third commandment, keep holy the Sabbath day, the Lord is saying, spend time with me. Don't go through your week and you have no time ordered towards being in a relationship. So all the commandments are about the relationship. And this is why Christ comes as the fulfillment, because he comes to bring us in relationship to the Father.